Hello and welcome. My name is Max Camplin. I'm an Executive Director at Cavendish and welcome to the latest in our series of Cavendish Talks events where we're going to be talking about the build-to-rent sector. So there's some very real issues in our housing market at the moment, and particularly in the rental arena. A few statistics. The cost of renting has risen over £100 a month over the last year. Almost half of all UK landlords have tried to sell their property in the last 12 months. In London, the average rent has gone up over £4,000 to over £24,000 in the last year. And UK rents are rising faster in more deprived areas. It's likely we'll have a change of government in the next 18 months. The Renters Reform Bill has been making its way through Parliament and has implications for the build-to-rent sector. Against that backdrop, Cavendish worked with YouGov on some polling to understand MPs' views of the BTR sector. Just 11% of UK MPs would prioritise BTR in their constituencies. It was only 7th out of 8 in terms of priorities for new housing developments in their constituency. And the other thing we found was that in terms of their understanding of affordability, there is a huge knowledge gap. So I'm joined today by an expert panel, which I'm delighted to introduce. First of all, Councillor Darren Rodwell, the leader of Barking and Dagenham since 2014, and the parliamentary candidate for the Barking seat in the next general election, and certainly one of the country's most effective local authority leaders, particularly around regeneration and development. His loss to local government will certainly be a gain to the national. I'm also delighted to introduce Kurt Mueller, who's the Director of Corporate Affairs at Granger, who are one of the leading developers of build to rent. And finally, my colleague Verity Barr, Director at Cavendish, who leads our corporate communications team, working with built environment clients across property, infrastructure and energy. So we're going to start by talking about this issue of why MPs don't prioritise build to rent in their constituencies. And there is a difference between the two parties as well. From a Conservative perspective, they prioritise private sale. 63% of Conservative MPs see that as the key thing. For Labour MPs, they're much more likely to prioritise council housing and social rent homes. Clearly, they're not prioritising build to rent. So the first question I want to ask, and I'll come to Darren first, is why do you think that is from the political side of things?
A number of reasons. The first one would be it's about understanding the product, and that's not well understood. It's clear by your polling. The next one I would say is because local government in itself doesn't understand the product and what it can do. And thirdly, I have to say that when the product was first introduced into the country by different providers, they had a high-end product that wasn't interesting to local government, because we've known for a long time now that social rent and affordable rent, so council equivalent rents, are what's needed. And we need a whole spectrum of different rent classes. We are now working with good providers who understand that. So we don't need the gated community with the gym. We need accessible buildings that are managed well by institutions to bring an outcome that works for the community. And a number of councils up and down the country have got into this place. I have a company myself that does that. In my borough, we have 2,200 homes that are in that sector, in effect. By 2026-27, that will be up to about 5,000. So we know it's part of the answer. It's not the full answer, but at the moment, there was a bit of bad positioning when it first came into the marketplace, which then didn't make it conducive for local government to understand it. Which then led to an issue with the MPs as well. And again, there's the ideology of who wants what in the two major parties.
I might come back to that point in a minute, just thinking about a future Labour government. So Kurt, if I can come to you from an industry perspective and your experience of operating within the UK, how do you think politicians perceive what you do? Is there this perception gap?
There absolutely is, but I don't find it too surprising because the industry is still very much at the foothills. Granger's been around for over 110 years, but we really started in build to rent about a decade ago in Barking and Dagenham. But the industry is still only 1 or 2% of the entire private rented sector. So it's unsurprising most politicians probably haven't interacted with it. So it's great that Darren and other councillors are there experiencing it in their constituencies and seeing the evolution of that product. But it's unsurprising that most politicians haven't. So I think it's behoven on the industry to really get out there, show them, invite them into our buildings, show them the communities, have them meet the residents, to increase that knowledge base, because the stats from the report are really fascinating, but again, probably are just part of the context, part of the reality of where the industry is at the moment. It's not going to be the entire solution, as you said. It will be part of the solution, but it can be a much bigger part of the solution. The potential for this sector to grow, to produce housing at the right price and at the right quality, and the money is there from the private markets, private capital is there. It just needs time to get the planning permissions and build these buildings.
And do you find that it tends to get lumped in with private rented sector as a whole? The sort of distinguishing features aren't brought out enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only way to really get people to know the difference is for them to come and visit.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the politics in a minute, but Verity, I just wanted to bring you in, just thinking from a wider sort of public perception point of view around build to rent. Clearly, if the parliamentary class aren't really engaging it and don't understand it, what does that mean from a public's point of view?
Well, I think there are elements of, Darren, what you said just now that I kind of agree and disagree with. So I think that you're right, when the build to rent sector really emerged and kind of came to the fore, it was positioned as something really quite aspirational, perhaps targeting young professionals, that slightly different market. I agree with you on that. When you say that positioning was wrong, that's the bit that I think maybe I challenge a little bit. I think perhaps at the time it was right, but over the last 10 years, we've changed so much, particularly obviously in the last 24 to 36 months with the cost of living pressures, with the challenges of lockdown, that actually now that isn't the right positioning for it. So I think that, as Kurt said, that the challenge for the sector now is to kind of get that piece right and build more understanding and deeper understanding of actually what can this sector provide now, and sort of shake off a little bit of that image. So it's not that it was wrong, but it just needs to evolve.
So I would say, and I will continue to say, it was wrong because it didn't work in my borough, if that's what you was going for. Now, the product, if you like, the 120 homes, because these are not products, they are homes. When Granger came along, they aimed themselves to get it all let in 6 months. It happened in 6 weeks. Why? Because they looked at what was going on around them, and bearing in mind, as a local authority, I've got a build to rent product company, homes, and we did that because we wasn't looking for the young professional, we were helping the squeezed middle. Because in the UK, you either had council housing, which was below par in a lot of ways, because the right to buy has actually destroyed the council housing product. You either had that as a product, so you had to be in need to get it. And most people are not in need. They're hard working, not best paid a lot. So they need a product that works. That's for this type of person that wasn't the majority of Londoners, and the issues London was even facing a decade ago. Or otherwise, some of us councils wouldn't have gone into that area, and by default, we're not in competition, but we gave a different product. So I have 6 different rent levels in my product, and what I've seen now is the industry look at that and go, actually, that's the place we need to be, which I'm pleased about. And yeah, it's the evolution. But I remember being on panels and having discussions like we're having today, people saying, oh, no, this is what we need for this, the young professional. No, we don't. We need homes for people. And actually, I think institutional funding will make a massive difference. And I remember the last report I saw, 41% of the PRS has disappeared in London since COVID. That's a massive reduction. Now, the fact of the matter is, RSLs, housing associations, are not building right now because of the constraints on them. Local authorities now are finding it difficult because actually austerity has caused us a lot of problems and we're starting to see councils fall over. So we do need that private long-term institutional investment that will invest in communities alongside councils. So I'm really pleased it's coming, and I, as you can tell, I champion this, and I want to make sure that the Labour Party understands that this can be part of the answer for what I call Build for Britain. Because I was saying this only last night, after the war in the 1940s, we came up with a whole 4 pillars of society. One was a big house building programme, the other was education and university, the other was social services and support, which with benefits, and the last was the NHS. Now what we've seen over this last 13 years is all 4 of them have crumbled, and over the last 40 years we've certainly seen it. So what we need to do is think about COVID in the same way we did after the war. We went through a 2-year war. We lost more people in East London from COVID than we did in the Blitz, right? So when you think about that as an issue, we need to think, what are our priorities? What are our values as a society? Now I think Keir has been very clear. You know, we're builders, not blockers. I think he's very clear that we're not going to do it alone as the state. We need to work with the private investment that gives us a long-term regain of our communities. So I think whilst they were not quite aligned where I'd want them to be, I believe now, talking to the industry, and I do because I am housing lead for London, and I've got a local government association where I lead on housing as well. So I'm talking to the industry up and down the country now, and we're all saying the same thing. So it's how do we bring that network together to get the homes that the country desperately needs.
You sort of mentioned it in some of what you were talking about in terms of prioritising it as a council and going into the build to rent area yourselves. And I think that sort of plays a little bit into our second question, which was about affordability and MP's understanding of the affordability of BTR. And without going into detail, there was a huge range of views. So it's clearly not an established view of what BTR offers to the market in terms of affordability. I just wonder, Kurt, I mean, I come to you first, just in terms of your view of the affordability of the product, the different things it can offer across all the, the different kind of people that, the homes for people that Darren mentioned.
Darren, you sort of used the word evolution. I think that's absolutely what the industry has been on. And interesting, that aspirational product, one of our first lessons in Barking when we set out on this was people, residents, renters within Barking and Dagenham initially assumed that they couldn't afford to live in our building. So the first thing we had to do to change our marketing was to say rent starting from this. And then suddenly people went, I actually can live in that type of property. And more than half of the residents in there are families, not young professionals. And affordability, I guess if you think about the long-term institutional capital that we represent and the shareholders that are invested in Grainger, the business model is required to have the buildings occupied and people paying rent. And you want those people paying rent to be able to afford that, because otherwise they're being stretched and you're not going to collect rent and you're going to have empty properties. So the starting point is affordability, and that's what Grainger focuses all of our attention on, is tracking everyone's affordability to making sure they're not being overstretched, but importantly that initially the rents we're setting match what local people can afford in that area, because that's good business sense, because then we can rent to the most people possible in that local constituency. And interestingly, what we saw during the pandemic, if you look at the official total pay index from the ONS against rents, again from the ONS, over the past decade or so, rents and wages track each other almost identically. So you can imagine as rents grow, they grow in line with what people can afford to pay, and that's what Grainger's philosophy is. As long as wages are going up, that's how rents should go. But what happened during the pandemic is rents started to flatten because a lot of landlords were slashing rents, trying to keep people, etc. wages continued to rise, and actually those started to separate. So what we see today is actually total pay has risen faster than rents have over the longer term, despite the headline showing rent spiking. And that's absolutely the case in certain circumstances, certain localities. But don't forget, we're starting from a low base during COVID, where rents fell and they're jumping up. And I think that's something in the context of looking at affordability is really key.
Do you see an issue emerging because of the point Darren made about the disappearing PRS from the market, that there is going to be much more pressure on the existing supply, and therefore that's going to have an impact on prices?
Absolutely. We're seeing that already. I mean, I think just a week or so ago, Grainger saw more leads in terms of potential renters interested in our property than we've ever seen before. I've worked in the company for 13 years. We've been around for 110. You know, we are having 120, 140 people interested in one property when we put it up on Rightmove. There is a real problem with supply, but then again, that's where in partnership and through with private capital, we need everyone building and providing supply, and that's where build to rent can come in. It's grown exponentially over the last 5 or 10 years since we've been on this path. You know, Grainger started with, you know, a few £10 million worth of investments. We now have over £3 billion of investment in this, and we're deploying another nearly £2 billion into supply. We're talking 10, 20,000 homes that we're trying to do, and we have many peers and competitors in this space doing the same. So I think it's really, that's what we need to see, is that supply get unlocked.
And Darren, obviously, because you've sort of embraced it, as it were, embarking Dagenham, clearly you have a view that it is a product that does work for a range of affordabilities, that can support some of those people at the lower levels, as well as obviously providing, you know, very nice rented accommodation for people who are wealthier.
Absolutely. So I see this as no different to what Peabody did 100 years ago. You know, someone who had wealth went, actually, I'm going to invest in community. And they did through homes. Now, it's a different model, but actually it's very similar. So if you take what we do as a council, so we're the biggest private landlord in the borough, but if you look at the housing stock that we have in the whole of the borough, we are also the biggest PRS proportionately. It's why we're the only council in the whole country that has a private landlord scheme that covers the whole borough. So the ward I represent is 72% HMO or PRS. Yeah, and that's a real issue for community stability. So actually it's also an issue for all the other issues like ASB, you know, all the other things that you will get, eyesore gardens, all the other things that are antisocial to community. So I welcome the fact that we will have long-term, stable, institutionalised management of swathes of property. Now, I don't mind whether it's private, as it is in Grainger's case, or whether it's Peabody, who are building a few thousand homes in my borough now, or whether it's us that do a mixture of both. We will get to a stage, I believe, where local authorities will do JVs with the likes of Grainger, because we do have the land, we do have the capability of supporting each other. And I think that will come, that will be part of the evolution. Because at the moment, if we look at London alone, there's 143,000 homes that are social affordable homes, 106, what we call the 106, where they should be built out. They've got planning permission, councils are waiting to do it. What we haven't got is the money. And the sad part about, for me, is the government at the moment is trying to play politics with people's homes rather than trying to find solutions that will give them the outcomes. We do need new partners into this space to help build. And again, we've got a massive green agenda. You know, we all want to see the retrofit happening as well. So there's a lot of opportunity here, but it's going to take leadership from the top to get the right policies in place, not the politicking that we're seeing at the moment.
And Kurt, do you find that you're perceived as being unaffordable when you're going into?
Well, I think the industry is trying to get away from that image, as you've referred to. I think Grainger has always been very focused on what we call the mid-market. As I mentioned, trying to ensure that we're pricing a product that's affordable to as many people in that local area as possible, because in our mind, that's good business. We'll fill the building up in 6 weeks instead of 6 months, and people will stay, right? Our average customer stays with us for nearly 3 years. We have almost 70% retention rate when people's leases come up to the end. We track On an annual basis, their net promoter score, how satisfied they are on the property, 9 in 10 of our customers really like their Grainger home. So we think we're doing something right, and we want to do more of it. I want to pick up something Darren said around the sort of, I think there's a great opportunity to leverage the private sector to invest in social housing and all its different shapes and sizes, because there's a lot of different tenures in there now, it's hard to keep track. And we have a few examples that we have been testing and building over time. So Grainger has its own in-house registered provider of social housing. We're regulated by the regulator. And we have nearly 1,000 affordable homes of all different shapes and sizes, again, shared ownership, affordable rent, and discount market rent. And I think there's so much more that we and all of our peers can do with local authorities. The joint venture point you made on public sector land is a huge missed opportunity that I think public sector bodies really need to grapple with. We've made a few headways. We've got a partnership with Transport for London. We're building thousands of homes on top of tube stations in and around London at 35 to 40% affordable housing levels, right? It's amazing, but we need to be doing more of that across all the public sector bodies.
Okay, we're going to sort of come back round to the theme of this and this sort of lack of awareness, lack of knowledge about the sector, and it being a barrier to us having more. And just sort of finish with a question for each of you. So Verity, I'd come to you first, just to think about that challenge for the sector and what it needs to do to change that knowledge gap, that awareness gap.
I think something that you've just said around that perception and positioning of BTR is really interesting. And I question almost, is there a need to rebrand BTR? I think at the moment there is so much negative discourse and discussion, particularly in the media, about rental properties as a whole, and it almost all becomes lumped together as one, with very good reason. And I think it then becomes a kind of echo chamber where members of the public, where consumers, where potential tenants are just hearing negativity about rental property. But that's clearly not the case. This is a really viable solution. And I think, as our polling showed, that there's this really big gap and lack of understanding amongst politicians. And perhaps now is the opportunity for these organisations, brands, to really demonstrate and tell this audience, we're fighting the good fight here. We're not all part of this one big media story that's playing out at the moment. And kind of interested to hear from you as being right in the kind of depths of that, what Grainger's take is.
This is a debate that we are having almost daily within the industry. Perennially, it's what else do we call it apart from build to rent? We haven't had an answer yet. But trying to really tell the story about who we're housing. So we are now tracking that. There's industry studies that both the British Property Federation and Business London produce, which looks at the demographics of build to rent to try to dispel the myth that it's for yuppies and high earners and etc. And it shows that it almost perfectly matches who rents in the general wider private rented sector. So at Grainger, the average wage of one of our residents is bang in line with the UK average, mid 30k per annum. 1 in 5 of our renters are a key worker. And I think those are the types of data points that we need to repeat and repeat and repeat and get out there. And more visits and more of our residents saying, hey, actually, I do eventually want to own a house, because I think that's still very sort of ingrained within the culture in the UK. But maybe I don't need to do it now, because actually the deal I'm getting from this institutional landlord that cares about my satisfaction is actually a pretty good deal, because they deal with the repairs. And on top of the rent, I'm getting free Wi-Fi, maybe I'm getting a gym, but I'm definitely getting taken care of and the repairs are getting done, because I think up until the last few years, that hasn't happened. So no wonder renters are trying to get out and own a house straight away, because they just want to avoid the trouble that we all hear about within the private rented sector. And we need to really distinguish ourselves from that.
And alongside that and those powerful personal stories, I think it's also about demonstrating all the positive work that the sector does in terms of regeneration as well, which again plays into that narrative that you were talking about, Darren, about the need to build broader communities, and that actually build to rent developers do that, but people just maybe don't think that they do.
City centre, brownfield, levelling up, labour mobility, we were speaking about that just before we started. And it's, this country is doing it as disservice if it doesn't harness the private sector and the build to rent sector to help be part of the solution to the housing crisis.
Yeah.
And I'll come to Darren just to finish in a minute, but Kurt, just in terms of what you would like to see happen from a policy perspective, from a political perspective, to change that? Are there any sort of key short-term moves that would make a massive difference? Is it about the planning system? Is it about the inability to get local authorities to listen? You know, what would be the big thing that changes it?
It's a long list, so I don't really know where to begin. I think it's really taking a step back from a politician's point of view to understand that we are different, and therefore treating us differently. And something I was speaking with colleagues earlier that we've been grappling with for a while, we've even been speaking to your colleagues, Darren, is selective licensing is a great example. This is something that has been designed for the mom and pop buy-to-let private rented sector. And what it means is a landlord like us have to fill out exactly the same form 100 times to tell them that we are compliant with all the rules that we should be compliant with, and then pay a fee. And we have to do that across 10 different boroughs, and it costs Grainger nearly £500,000 across the country to tell them what we own and that we're being compliant with regulations. It's just nonsensical within that large-scale institutional market. We should be filling out one form per building, for example. And I think that's just an example of how the system sort of just needs to understand build to rent differently, whether it's 106 agreements in the planning system and how we can support social housing, whether it's selective licensing. I think there's a myriad of opportunities. I think there's big reform coming to the rental markets with the rent reform bill. And I know Keir and the Labour Party are talking about that and more. And I think that's great. And the build to rent sector is probably doing 99% of that already. And we can help discuss how we can go further.
And Darren, I want to finish with you as the politician on the panel, soon to be an MP. At the moment, it's not a priority for MPs. They clearly, there's a lack of knowledge. They're not exposed to it, as Kurt has said. Do you think under a future Labour government there is the prospect of BTR becoming much more important on a national level?
If I do get to the national level, I would say I'll be banging the drum for it being part of the answer. Because actually there is a problem, there isn't enough of us that understand it, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And it's quite interesting because my own company, if you like, the wholly owned company, has to do the same form you have to do. But that's because that's what nationally we've been told we've had to do. Every local authority has to run within whatever framework's been put in front of them by the national government. And I'm hoping that there is a lot of local government candidates in the Labour Party for sure, and a lot of them have a lot of experience around what we're having to do on the ground. So if we said council housing, council housing, council housing, we know none of us are doing that. We're doing a lot of mixed tenure housing. Some of it will be council, a lot of it's council built, a lot of it's at different levels. So I wrote a paper a little while ago called Build for Britain, which I put into the sausage machine of the party to get them to look at. And the right to rent, so I used the right to rent, the right to invest and the right to move. The right to rent, first of all, I said there had to be a very strong renters' charter that talked about how our responsibilities, whether they're state or private, and what we have to do to make sure they're good quality, safe homes that are ecologically friendly and doing the right thing. But actually there's also responsibilities on those people that take those homes as well. And I take that from the Becontree estate. Everyone used to clean their step, have white nets, purely because they didn't want the rent man kicking them out back in the 1930s. But that evolution has been, there's a lot of pride in people. So how do we carry that on? Because actually the product's only as good as our people look after it, whether it's us as the institutional agents or whether it's the individual. So that was the one. The other one is there has to be what I call community rent levels. And that's because no one area is the same. And what my community can afford will be very different to what even Newham or Havering or Redbridge, either side of me, the borough, can afford. So we have to look at it as a community. Now, some of those will be at council equivalent rents, and you've just said you started out your own RP, which is fantastic to know, because actually then you can bring a product that brings a truly mixed community, rather than having, you know, private over here of a certain standing, public over here of a different standing. Actually, we start bringing mixed community, and that's really important. The other thing I believe we need is a national housing register. So we already have it. We have the land registry anyway, but we need to upgrade that where local government is the enforcers, but also the regulator at a local level. So every building that's built is known to the state and the industry. So it will stop rogue landlords. It will stop the issue of poor maintained general purpose properties as well. But it will also allow the institutions to do longer investment into the properties, which then won't cost the state or the citizen money, because the institutions will get their money back over time, because all of these properties will be so efficient that they'll give them a surplus of reward. So, and the industry is starting to look at that. When we were in MIPIM earlier this year, they're already looking at that as a product. So in effect, it will be like an MOT for the house, like you do with your car. And if we can do those three things, and I know that the Labour Party are looking at a number of issues. I speak with Matthew Pennycook quite a lot. He's the Shadow Housing Minister. And Mike Ainsbury's now in there as well as house build and homelessness. Again, I've worked with Mike before now in my roles. And what's really great is we've got Angela Rayner in DLUC. So we've got the Deputy Future Prime Minister in charge of the most important thing, which is community and homes. So that shows you how serious the Labour Party is going to take this moving forward, in my opinion.
That's great, thank you. That's all time we've got today. I want to thank the panellists for their time and their insight. Make sure you download our polling report from our website. But thank you and goodbye.